Hey, everybody. Oh my gosh. Welcome back to the 7 Minute Workshop. If you haven't joined before, this is where we're talking to experts, breaking down timely topics, complicated topics that affect your business. And we do it in just 7 minutes. Our producer, Kendall, says she can hold a plank for 7 minutes. But I want proof. By the way, audience, you can join her if you like. And we're going to check in at the end to see if she actually did it or not. I'll tell you when to go, Kendall. Okay, this is our last installment under the theme of managing a hybrid workforce. And we're concluding with best practices for remote onboarding, something that many of us have had to do in these past several months. We're going to talk about how it differs from in-person onboarding and how you can address those differences, some best practices, what to avoid, and more. And to do that, we're bringing on NetSuite experts, Hanif Ismail. He's the Vice President of Strategy and Product Management for NetSuite HCM. And we have Marc Holliday. He is our Senior Product Marketing Manager. And we're going to dive in with some of their advice, suggestions, and insights. Before I bring them on, a reminder, if you have any questions, you can ask them in the comments. We'll get to them at the end of the conversation. Also, if you have any thoughts on remote onboarding or things that have worked for your business, throw them in the comments too. We'd love to share them with other viewers. Have you changed your processes for onboarding? Is remote onboarding more difficult, less difficult? How have you tried to make it a great employee experience? Don't be shy. And if you don't have any questions, you can give us a shout out. Tell us where you're tuning in from. We've had people sign in from all parts of the world, and we'd love to give you a shout out right back. We've had people tune in from all parts of the US, South America, UAE, Europe, and Africa, and more. We may actually hit almost every continent at this point. So let's keep it up. All right, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Hanif Ismail and Marc Holliday. Hey, Marc. Hey, Hanif. Thanks for joining us again.
Hey, Fritz. Great to be back here with you.
Hey, Fritz. Hey, Marc. Great to be here.
Okay, Marc, we're going to start out by talking about why we're talking about onboarding. How does it impact employee retention, productivity, engagement, things like that?
Yeah, I think we're talking about onboarding because there's a lot of companies out there that are in the process of trying to hire a lot of people to keep their businesses growing and moving forward. And the other part of it too is I think companies are starting to realize that they need to do a better job of measuring the onboarding process itself. It's no longer a folder of papers with a company pen and a company coffee mug to welcome somebody into the company. And those three metrics that you mentioned really do matter. In fact, Glassdoor recently issued a survey report that said companies that have successful onboarding programs can increase first-year productivity by as much as 80%. And when it comes to levels of engagement, another survey said that if in that first year they can get 30% higher engagement from a successful onboarding process. And then retention is another key metric that Deloitte issued a survey on that said those that have a successful onboarding process can increase that first year retention by about 60%. So companies that hit high on all three of those measurements generally translates into good financial performance for the company.
Those are some amazing stats. I think they draw a very fine point on the necessity of this topic. Hanif, what are the key differentiators between remote onboarding and in-person onboarding?
It's a really interesting question, and I've lived in both of those kind of models. So I've lived and I've engaged in a company in a remote model, and then I've engaged with them in a physical at the office kind of a model. I think, in speaking from that perspective as well, from an employee's perspective, I think the biggest challenge is building that emotional connection with the company and your team itself, the team that you're going to be working on, especially since you aren't co-located together. And of course, in the topic of this, that you're working from a remote perspective. It's very easily, and you can very easily get disconnected. You can feel isolated very quickly as well if the human touch isn't there, if the regular communications aren't there. that can break down very quickly. So normally, you know, in the office, you'll meet some people and so forth, and you can build that bond. But obviously, in a remote situation, it's very different. So you clearly have to give some thought around that. I think the other one that comes to mind is probably keeping new hires engaged, especially in the early months of their arrival. So when a person, or let's just say in a person situation at the office, I should say, the supervisor may be able to informally guide them day to day. You meet them in the hallway and they say, hey, Hanif, you know, this might be a better way to do this, or hey, you can get connected with this individual who can help you out with this particular thing. In a remote situation, you can't do that. You can't easily knock on somebody's door physically or have those hallway conversations. So you may have to think about, let's say, a much more formal process going forward, especially with remote situations. I'd say probably the last thing that would come to mind is increased logistical challenges. And what I mean by that is that, you know, we've all heard situations where employees start, even in a physical office kind of situation, they start and oops, their laptop's not there. And it doesn't come till a week later or 2 weeks later. I've heard big horror stories on there and a lot of stats around this as well. But in that kind of situation where the laptop's not there, in a remote situation, in fact, it's worse because in an office situation, okay, the laptop's not here. You could say, hey, go talk to Susan upstairs in the IT department and she'll hook you up with a loaner or something like that. Well, you can't really do that in a remote situation. Going upstairs might be my bedroom. That's not going to help, right? So you don't have that flexibility anymore and that agility anymore. So planning ahead is going to be essential.
We have some shout outs. Mukesh, hi everyone. Guido from Argentina, thank you. Kendall is still holding strong on her plank. Good job, Kendall. Hanif, building emotional connections, keeping new hires engaged, logistical challenges. Can you give us a few quick tips to make those work?
Yeah, I think like the topic I talked about, the emotion connections, on that side, maybe doing some sort of virtual communities. A lot of people have been doing some coffee times kind of thing, virtual games that they've been facilitating as well. I think also onboarding in groups as opposed to singular, I think that might foster some emotional connection as well. You know, one of my ex-bosses had said something where he had actually solicited people to email me before I actually started, so pre-boarding kind of thing. And I got a bunch of emails from his direct reports, some of my stakeholders. I started building those relationships early on up front, and I started feeling an affinity to that company, if you will, or affinity to that company and emotion to that company very quickly. So something like that could also help. On the new hire situation, in terms of just keeping them focused and engaged, I would say consider building a 30, 60, 90-day plan. I think that can go a long way. And then as part of your onboarding process as well, think about setting up your performance goals at the same time. Have that as part of the 90-day plan as well. And then on the logistical challenges, as I mentioned before, just plan way ahead. Plan ahead, include that as part of your pre-boarding process as well.
Great, some good advice there, Marc. What are some of the components of a good onboarding plan?
Well, as Hanif was saying, you know, first of all, it has to have structure. You know, it could take anywhere from a week to a year to fully onboard somebody, depending on the industry and the role. And you really want to be aiming for creating an environment of success for that employee in their new role. There's some legal requirements that need to be in your onboarding plan, you know, making sure that they have the right to work in the country and so forth. But it also needs to have measurable goals, as Hanif was saying, you know, 30, 60, 90 days, even longer, just so the new employee can kind of see exactly what's expected of them and sees the path forward. It should be automated as much as possible, especially in the remote world. Passing paperwork back and forth through email is no longer very efficient or effective. And I also think it's about that connection, especially to the company. It just doesn't happen naturally anymore. You walk into a building with your new company's name on it, and you already feel part of something. But in a remote environment, managers have to be a lot more intentional with their onboarding plans and making sure that the employees get through them successfully.
Thanks, Marc. And if our audience wants more on this, we have an entire onboarding plan in the article link that we shared in the caption. So feel free to check that out, do a screen grab, whatever you want. It's there to help you out. I'd like to now open it for some questions from the audience. We're at the end of our 7 minutes. Kendall has either collapsed on the floor or passed out. I'm not sure, but good job on that. I hope some of you joined during that. Keep shouting out. We'll do our best to say hello and answer as many questions throughout the remainder of our time. Our first question is going to be to Hanif. How can businesses create a virtual community in this sort of remote environment that seems to be one of the essential components?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we all have to think very differently as we go forward. I think there's going to be a lot of innovation in this space as well. And if you look at the basics, I think there's stuff like instant messaging channels, whether it's Slack or something else, having that in there so that you can have an informal conversation. Doesn't always have to be a meeting, having that in place, having channels in place to be able to support Q&A kinds of questions, especially during the onboarding process. I might have a benefits question or payroll question. Who do I go to, right? So having stuff like that in place, having all your policies, having your team's content centralized in a central repository can dramatically help as well. Virtual team building, which I think I mentioned before with virtual games and recognizing community participation and so forth, I think are all good things that can absolutely help as well. And then, I think at the end of the day, as people start going into the offices, you get into hybrid situations and so forth, it's also accepting that video conferencing is a new norm and working with that on a day-to-day basis. Even though you're in the office and you've got a few people there, remember the folks that are not in the office and make sure that you're using your video cameras and so forth.
Okay, we have a question from Easton in Santa Monica who says his girlfriend was busy holding a 7-minute plank. How can companies figure out whether their remote onboarding processes are successful, Marc?
Well, there's a couple ways. First of all, if you're not already doing it, you need to be measuring your onboarding process. And the first way to start understanding the effectiveness of it is to inquire with your new employees. 90 days is a generally accepted checkpoint to see how they're doing, but I would also recommend that you extend that out to 90 and 365 days. It's a continuous process and it takes longer in a remote environment. So making sure that you're continually checking in and measuring that and asking the employees. Another good measurement is just to compare to your current employees, especially in terms of voluntary and involuntary turnover rates. If you have a voluntary or a combined turnover rate of say 8% across the company, but then you look at your first year employees and they have a rate of like 15%, that's probably an indicator that your onboarding process isn't as effective as it needs to be to retain those new hires.
Excellent. Okay, good numbers to keep in mind. We have a hello from Mary Josephine, who's in the Philippines, and also from, and I hope I don't butcher this name, Haika, says hello. We have a question from Ian in Colorado. What onboarding strategies, innovative, creative onboarding strategies have you seen businesses implement? That one can go to
I can take that. Yeah, I could take that one. I've seen different things in different places, different companies, but the ones that stand out is one of the ones that I've seen is just companies sending swag boxes, right? Sweaters of their company logo and all sorts of gadgets like that and so forth, and just giving and helping people immerse into their culture. The one that really stood out for me is probably this concept of virtual exhibits, where you go to a virtual conference these days and it's like a fair. And if you remember the exhibit floors that they have where they have different booths set up. So now think about all of that being virtual and you can go into one booth and talk to somebody about benefits virtually. You can ask them questions. You can see what sort of benefits are available and so forth. You might have another one that might be an IT kind of a booth. Hey, let me see the latest technology you guys are using. That might be pretty cool. Social impact activities that are, how do I get involved with different activities? So you may have different virtual booths set up that you can get engaged with, ask questions, and collaborate with people. I think that's the one that's really stood out for me.
We have Andy gave us this suggestion, which I think is really good. Having a buddy as a first point of contact is a huge help, and that's a really good point. I think I've had that almost everywhere I've been, and it's just kind of a nice easing in point. We have a hello from Karthikeyan. Oh, God, help me pronounce that. From India. Hello from India. I had a friend of mine from India make me a wonderful meal tonight, some fried rice and some sort of lentil dish that was amazing. Here's a question from Mukesh, who's asking about the balance of office work and family environment. And I think this is an especially interesting question when you have so many people working more and more from home. Marc, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, balancing work and life has become different for all of us. When you work from home, you never really leave the office, and so there's an intentional effort that's needed on both the manager and the employees front. I mean, first and foremost, the manager needs to, just clearly explain what the remote working policies are, and then showing some empathy and making sure that the employees are not overwhelmed and feel that connection. That's one of the main things in this onboarding process when you're working from home, is to make that connection to that company. And so I think it really just needs to be an upfront conversation, and managers really have to communicate with their employees probably a little bit more than they're used to when they can see them every day in an office.
Sure. Yeah, that makes. Go ahead.
Just to add to that, Marc, I think those are excellent points. One of the things that we've always noticed is the number of meetings just dramatically increase, and it tires people out. It literally tires people out. So trying to manage those meetings, also managing your calendar is another key point, which is, block off times when you're expected not to work, because otherwise, to Marc's point, you're at your desk, it'll go on and on and on. It's very natural to continue to go on, and I'm in the middle of something, I'll keep working. But block off your calendar, stop people from making, appointments when it's outside of those working hours and so forth. Tips like that, I think, can go a long way. But it's certainly, we've seen people burn out of that, and you want to absolutely as managers, keep your ears to the ground and make sure that you're doing one-on-one meetings and so forth, and listen for those signs, if you will.
Or look for them.
Yeah, look for them. It's better.
You see Zoom calls and so forth.
Totally.
Sure. Yeah. We have a question from Lindsay in North Carolina. It says, y'all, what skills do managers need to improve to make remote onboarding successful? Marc, we'll go back to you on that.
Yeah, I'll start with planning. They really need to become better planners and have those 90 to 6 month plans ready to go on day one, and setting performance goals is a great way to do that. I think they also have to ask themselves, the managers that is on those 4 points of connection we talked about last time when it comes to engagement. How am I connecting this employee to the company? How am I connecting this employee to myself? How am I connecting them to their work? And how am I connecting them to their teams? And they have to be a lot more intentional with their planning and their communication, and making sure that they're managing to that work-life balance that's become so much front and center these days, that checking in with their employees just to make sure they're feeling okay, and then starting to feel that connection, because that's what's going to make the onboarding process successful for everybody, the manager, the employee, and the company.
We have one last question for you, Hanif, just a way to wrap up this entire series, I think. And, you know, we are NetSuite and we like to help people with these things. Can you talk a little bit about the systems that can help improve all of this?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of fold. I think from the Suite People NetSuite side of the house, there's certainly core HR capabilities, which allows you at the basic level to consolidate all of your data from multitude of places into one place about your talent, about your people. That's one aspect of it. We also have payroll capabilities that allow you to pay people appropriately, take into account state regulations, federal regulations, and so forth. I think specifically at the topic at hand, which this kind of goes to it in a natural manner, which is we have electronic onboarding capabilities as well. So with that, you can embed different steps, if you will, as part of, you can orchestrate your onboarding process with multitude of steps, and you can embed things like our self-service capabilities as part of those steps as well. And then what Marc also mentioned, performance management as an example. You can embed that in there. You can create your 90-day plan in there. You can also then establish your performance goals as part of the process, as part of that ongoing onboarding process, but then performance process. I think the other kinds of things are directory and org charting capability, especially when you're new and you're trying to figure out who's who, right? In the organizations, things like that can help as well. And then just analytics to be able to get some insight on your workforce, understanding turnover, understanding retention, understanding productivity, and so forth. Outside of Suite People and NetSuite, let's say, even looking out there, you know, leveraging what I mentioned before, the virtual exhibit kind of capabilities and looking at that thing. Online microboards, I think they're called, like online whiteboard tools kind of capabilities, collaboration capabilities, tools like instant messaging kind of things, Slack and so forth. Again, supporting Q&A kind of channels on there for people that are being onboarded. And then, of course, video conferencing and those kind of tools as well would certainly help tremendously.
Great. Well, that is all we have time for today. Marc and Hanif, thank you so much for joining us over the past few weeks. We've tagged your LinkedIn handles on LinkedIn if anyone would like to connect with you further. We really appreciate all your insights these past few weeks.
Thank you, Fritz. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, Fritz. Thanks, Marc.
Okay.
Thanks, Hanif.
As always, a big thanks to all of you for tuning in. We're skipping next week due to Labor Day holiday here in the U.S. And we'll be back on September 14th with a brand spanking new theme, preparing for the 2021 holiday season. It's a season in flux, and we know that it's a top of mind for a lot of you out there. Again, that's happening on Tuesday, September 14th at 11:30 a.m. Pacific time. We'll see you then.